All right, welcome to our webinar series on developing principled Christian leaders, sponsored by the Congregational Vitality Team of the East Ohio United Methodist Church. And today's topic is creating a leadership culture. There's a handout for this session, and it would be helpful for you to have that with you as we go through the course. My name is Ken Willard, and I'm with the organization Leadership for Transformation, and I'll be your host today. So let me open us with a word of prayer. Father God, thank you for this time together, for this session about growing leaders for your kingdom. And I just pray that your Spirit guides our hearts and our minds, helps us to discern your will, and help us to stay focused on growing leaders who can grow your kingdom here on earth. In Christ's holy name, amen. All right, so leadership. We've been talking about leadership a lot in these sessions. So tonight we're going to focus on creating a leadership culture. In my work as a trainer with various organizations, we would use a process to determine the appropriate type of training to deliver and also the effectiveness of that training. So no matter what we're doing, it always started with a needs assessment. So I thought that'd be a good place for us to start today as we're talking about leadership culture in your ministry. So you'll see a couple of questions on your handout and on the screen. So let's start with the first one. So I would just love to hear briefly from each person who's on the webinar tonight. What are you doing to currently develop ministry leaders?
Well, I'm doing the ministry process with a person that is going on into the ministry. So I'm helping her, and then we're actually doing a training of the SPR committee of what their responsibilities are. That's a
Good.
key thing.
Good. Very good. Thank you for sharing that. Who else?
I'd have to say that mostly through one-on-one type contact. In my context, we have a lot of good leadership already.
Mm-hmm.
More of the emphasis is building spiritual leadership. So anything we're doing in leadership development probably is going to be more in spiritual development to help people who already demonstrate leadership to really take on the role of spiritual leadership.
Good. Good. Thank you.
And some of the things, Justina, we're doing is basically talking about what leaders should do. Started out with the first of the year, what their positions was in each of the groups, and then doing some one-on-one with people that feel that they would have the potential to do it. So that's one-on-one, and then trying to talk about it and then lead by example.
Excellent. Excellent. Very good. Very good.
I think through our Compass Group process, one of the things that we hope to do is develop leaders. And that happens not only through them living out the Compass process, but also the twice a year gatherings that I have with them as Compass leaders for more training, more discussion, more development, hopefully.
Right. Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. So those are some great, foundations for us to build on. I think it's good to always at least pause and look and see what are we doing now before we start jumping off into anything new. Most of the time, what we're doing can be very effective as we build for the next stage. So next question is, where does it hurt? When you think about, leadership development in your church, in your ministry, think about leaders, what issues or challenges have you been experiencing with leadership?
This is Kurt. I would think probably the biggest frustration and difficulty is people are so busy, already committed to so many things, including demanding careers. And it's hard to find leadership that can invest in the life of the church to the level that's, sometimes needed or desired. And then also just you have people who have a heart for the church, but they also have their work demands that create a lot of pressures that make it difficult.
Right. Very true. Thank you. Who's next? Where does it hurt?
I think that probably the hurt part of it is that over the years they've thought they were the good leaders, but if they look at it and realize that it's not moving, I think that's the hurt part of it, is that when you have to help them understand they're not where they need to be. And some of the programs that you try to do with them, there's that pushback. And so you have to be very cautious in how you approach that.
Very good. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that.
Probably the only thing I would have to say is the commitment level is hard to, like Kurt said, everybody's so busy. And even when you give them stuff to do that is very simple, it's hard for them to accomplish it. So I don't know if it's too busy or just that's not something they're used to doing. Just to do a Bible study on leadership qualities is difficult. So I find that'd be the only place I think so far.
Good. Thank you.
I think for me, where I am, and it just everything feels like it moves so slowly. So I think the hard part is developing the leaders quickly enough to be able to do what you hope to accomplish.
Right. Excellent. Yeah, leadership has a lot of similarities to discipleship. One of them is as a disciple, we're never really done. There's always a next step. There's always somewhere to grow. And I think that's very true with leadership. Wherever we are on our leadership journey, there's another step ahead of us. And sometimes the challenge is helping people, see what those steps are, encouraging them, things like that. So, this is definitely a very incomplete needs assessment. There's a lot more that we could and probably should do in each ministry just to kind of see where we are. But hopefully this gives you an idea of what that might look like to begin to, assess where we are now. It's great to look at where we've been and where we are now before we look forward into the next step. So I'm going to share with you 5 common approaches to leadership development that I've seen used in different organizations, churches included. They're not the only approaches to leadership development. There are many different ones. These are just 5 that I've experienced quite a bit, both in business and in churches. The first one is what I call the random approach, and this is often the most common approach used to leadership development. In this type, the organization seems to do leadership development haphazardly. They choose the topics or the competencies based on what's hot at the moment. Sometimes it's what's available. Sometimes it's what's within the budget. A new book comes out and every leader should read it. The district's bringing in a guest speaker to talk about leadership. So, let's all register for that. Now, random is not bad. And I don't want to imply that at all. Some leadership development, I would say, is always better than none. So it's always great to at least be doing something. One challenge with this type of approach is that it can feel very random to your leaders. And because of that, sometimes it will come across that leadership development is a low priority because we're treating it randomly. There's no real specific intentional approach. So the first approach is random. The second one is, the pain approach. This is where, leadership development is used to put out fires. Something goes wrong, or we hear some complaints. There appears to be some kind of trend or something like that. So we immediately reach into the bag or find some leadership development approach to try to address that pain. So, an example would be our leaders are always late for meetings, so we need to do some time management training. That may or may not, be what really is needed there. Again, leadership training in this area to address these kind of issues is not bad. But another challenge is that we may not be addressing the correct issue. There may be something else at play, and what we're addressing is really the surface, because that's typically where pain, hangs out, is right at the top. Another consequence of this approach is that we may send the signal that we only do leadership development when something goes wrong. So, we'll talk more about closing gaps, especially closing gaps in performance issues in our next seminar tomorrow, and how to address those correctly. Another approach is the organizational approach. And this one actually doesn't show up as much in church as it does in business world. It does sometimes show up in very large churches because of the structure in those churches. In this scenario, the senior leader, the pastor, or maybe the executive team, individuals like that, will decide what competencies all of their leaders need to focus on for leadership development, and they'll create leadership development to address those issues. So let me pause right here for just a second, because I've used the word competency a couple of times. If you'll look at page 3 in your handout, I just want to share that there's a list there of leadership competencies. There's also a definition. Leadership competencies are the skills or behaviors which contribute to the success of both the individual and the organization. Again, by no means is that a complete list. There are probably as many competencies as you could probably think of, but that's a pretty good starting point. Those are some of the competencies that I've worked with different organizations and churches. So just to give you an idea, and just to help, since we've used that word a couple of times. So let's look forward on to the fourth approach. So the fourth approach is the individual approach. In this case, each leader identifies their specific wants and needs, and then the organization or the church would provide leadership development for those areas. So each person kind of picks from a menu. So here's what I want, and it's really based solely on their wants and needs. And then the fifth approach is the strengths-based approach to leadership development. And this one is based on the work of the Gallup organization. If you're familiar with Gallup Strength Finders, that's really where this comes from. All leadership development in this case is done focused on where the leader is already strong, because that's where Gallup's research says they have the greatest opportunity to grow. So again, these are just 5 common approaches that I've seen. Obviously not all of the approaches. There's lots of different ways to do leadership development. Which of these approaches, if any, have you experienced either in your church work or somewhere else?
Seems like random for us. Random, every time something comes along, new program or a new book, it seems like, okay, let's jump on that bandwagon.
Right. And again, that's not bad. That's,
Right.
So-
Right.
Anybody else?
We have used Strength Finders.
Okay. Good.
Helpful. And it's pretty easy to get random as well. And oftentimes those emerge. And then sometimes simply the individual, because of the nature of church work, where sometimes there's a lot of emphasis that needs to be put in an area like, building program, stewardship campaigns, those sort of things.
Right. Excellent.
I think I've experienced a little bit of all those at one time or another. And maybe in some ways I've experienced them as somebody who's organized those. I heard, webinars are the coolest thing, so here we are.
Right. Right. I was going to say, I think I've been on both sides, or maybe 3 or 4 sides of all of these.
Mm-hmm.
I've been the recipient certainly of all of them, and probably delivered my share of all of them too. So, all right. So we're going to look at a different way to think about it. And again, I really want to encourage, if you've attended any of these other webinars, I know you've heard us talk about, the spiritual side of leadership development. We're not focusing it on as much in this session as we have in some of the other sections, but obviously leadership development in the church world is and should be very spiritual. And, we want to really keep it grounded in discipleship. So, similar to any discipleship is probably better than none. I still believe the best discipleship is when it's intentional, on everybody's part. So I think the same applies with leadership. So we're going to look at just briefly kind of creating a culture of leadership development. Now, one of the things I think that's wonderful is this is something that any church of any size, of any type, can absolutely do, because it's totally scalable. So whatever your size, whatever your congregation, no matter how many are there, it's not about creating this huge program or process or anything. It's just really about making the shift to where leadership development in the ministry is more intentional. So if you look on the screen or again on your handout, you'll see when you think about the 3 different areas: the individual leader, the ministry where they serve, because someone serving as a leader in children's ministry is going to require, different types of leadership than someone who is serving as facilities chair. There's a lot of leadership as leadership, but it is also important, I think, to think about the specific ministry areas. So individual leader, ministry team, and then the church overall. And, as you see in the illustration, the area of maximum payoff, I believe, is when we hit the sweet spot, where there's the overlap of all 3. So that's where everybody wins. Now, we'll probably never hit that sweet spot 100% of the time with 100% of the people. But I think the important thing is that's a target to aim for, rather than just, haphazard, or rather than just, hoping for the best, at least having the intentionality of shooting for that. So I'm going to share a few best practices that, again, kind of picked up over the years, both church and business world, and just encourage you to think about and to pick, pick maybe 1 or 2. Think about 1 or 2 that really might apply in your ministry setting. So the first is, no more one and done, really creating a culture where we change the paradigm of doing leadership development once and that's it, or going to one seminar or doing one event, but really making it a continuous process. Again, very similar to discipleship. The next best practice is creating an on-ramp. How can we get leaders who aren't currently engaged either in leadership in the church and or developing themselves as leaders? How can we get them engaged? What should all of your leaders do first? That's a great thing to think about and to process with your team or with your leadership team. What do they feel every leader should do first? The next is to identify a few, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 topics or competencies, things like that, that you feel so strongly that they're mission critical for all of the leaders in your ministry. What are those, just 3 or 4, maybe 5 at the most things, when you look at that list of competencies or you think about leadership topics, what are the things that just you really want to ensure your leaders are learning and growing and getting better at? Related to specifically the last best practice, then it's about, I think, creating some type of curriculum. Now, you can certainly, spend a lot of money. You can hire somebody to create curriculum, or you can find stuff online. You can create something very simple. I don't think it's a matter, again, of spending a lot of money. That's why I think every church can do it. But it is about identifying those competencies, those topics, and then having some way to actually grow leaders in those areas. And that's where, curriculum can come in handy helping you do that. Another best practice, I think, again, for any church of any size, is to have a captain. Have somebody, maybe it's your ad board chair, maybe it's just somebody in the church that's not in a position, a formal position, but they're a great leader. Have somebody just who's going to captain leadership development in your church and can come alongside and really help you so that if you're the pastor or if you're in some other position, you don't have to take on an additional responsibility. You can have somebody else really drive this. I would always lift up Christian leadership coaching. I think it's a great tool to go alongside any kind of leadership development. So wherever possible, at least providing access to a Christian leadership coach to your leaders, I think is a wonderful way to help them apply what they're learning. I'm a big believer in information plus application equals transformation. And I think a Christian leadership coach can really help leaders do that. And then finally, there are great books out there. It's always powerful for a leadership team to kind of read a book together. There are some great retreats, and you can even put together a leadership retreat for your team. Bring in a guest speaker. There are conferences. Willow Creek Association does a wonderful leadership summit every year. Church of the Resurrection in Kansas City does a great leadership institute every year. But one of the things that I would challenge you on is there is leadership development going on in your community right now. And it may be done at another church. It may be done at a bank. It may be done at the public library. But I would guarantee somebody in your community is doing leadership development. And I think it's wonderful when we can partner with other resources like that. So, and the last thing I would share there is surveys. Gallup, we mentioned earlier, also DISC, Myers-Briggs. Those are wonderful ways for leaders to learn about themselves and to help see how their leadership affects others, and to really understand what makes not just themselves tick, but other people. So just a few best practices. So I covered all that really quickly. Let me just pause and, open it up. Questions, comments, something maybe that jumped out at you?
Could you flesh out those competencies just a little bit more on page 3?
Sure. Is there something specific?
Develop that one, the second one. You know, the developing others, decision making, following up.
Yeah. So, you know, like with any of the competencies, it's about growing that skill and helping leaders see how important that is. So the competency here of developing others, the best leaders understand that leadership is about growing other leaders. You know, and again, I would connect this to discipleship. You know, I think true discipleship has to have the element of not just discipling somebody else, but helping them get to the point where they're now discipling others. And I think the same is true for leadership. So in developing others, you know, I would include things like mentoring, things like, you know, looking for, intentionally finding other people who have that leadership skill, that leadership gift, and helping them see that in themselves and growing it. You know, there's lots of resources, there's lots of things that they could do to develop that competency. But I think that's a key competency for especially for senior leaders, for leaders who are further down the path. Good question. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, very good. I added mentoring to that list. Yeah, that's real good. Thank you.
Anything else? Any other? If not, then I would, you know, open it up for, you know, key learnings. Is there anything from tonight's session that that was especially helpful for you? Something, if you don't have a question, I'd love to just hear a key learning from everyone before we wrap up.
The phrase "mission critical" has just jumped out at me, and that's something that I'm going to remember and keep thinking about. You know, what is it, mission critical? Because it insinuates you need to have an idea of your mission focus to know what is mission critical. So,
yes, yeah, we have a tendency sometimes to treat everything the same. Even if we try to treat everything as important. And I think it's worth it to figure out what are those mission critical things? What are the things that are going to actually move us closer or advance the mission that we're on? Good, thank you. Who's next? Keela?
This is Tina. I think what I wrote down, and really, I think I remember it from the last seminar too that I attended, was that leadership is similar to discipleship and it's ongoing. I think that that's really important to remember that, because too often we think that once a leader, always the leader at their fullest potential, and they're not. I was reminded of the book Good to Great Leaders, and that's kind of like what you're talking about, moving on and not just staying where you're at.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Ken, this is Kurt. How much do you think leadership is purely natural, and how much of it do you think can be taught?
That's a great question. So, you know, there are different schools of thought, and if you ask a dozen, you know, leadership experts, you'll probably get a dozen different answers. So I'm only going to give you my answer. I have really come to believe, after doing this for, you know, 30-something years, I tend to believe it's both. I think that, I know there is a leadership gift, a spiritual gift of leadership. And I have seen it in others. I have seen people who have that extra special spiritual gift of leadership, and I celebrate that. And I have also seen those who just don't have that gift. They weren't born with that natural ability, but they worked really hard at it, and they became great leaders. So, in my experience, is the only thing I can speak to. I've seen both. So I really think it is a both and. I think it's wonderful when you receive that gift or that skill, or however you want to, talk about it. But I would also say, just like every other spiritual gift, the responsibility then is to develop it. I don't think any of us should, take a spiritual gift for granted, including leadership. It's got to be developed. So that was a long answer to your short question, but I hope that was okay. Anything else? All right. Well, I will wrap up and just share with you. We always like to share some resources. There are several great books listed in your handout. I'm going to highlight 3 of them here on the screen. Jim Collins wrote Good to Great, which is probably one of the best, leadership books I think anybody could ever read. It's a wonderful book. But he also wrote, this small kind of almost a pamphlet, but it's called Good to Great and the Social Sectors. And if you haven't read it, I would recommend it. It's a quick read. But I would also recommend, Willow Creek has a DVD of all of Jim Collins's speeches or sessions at the Willow Creek Leadership Summit. Excuse me, and I think there's 5 or 6 of them, and they are outstanding. So if you're looking for something to share with your leadership team, those are great resources there. Leadership on the Line is another wonderful book. Bishop Robert Snazy is the one that turned me on to that a few years back. It's a great resource. I would highly recommend it. And then somebody kind of close over in the next conference, Sue Nelson Kibbe wrote Ultimately Responsible a few years back. And it's a wonderful, wonderful book, a great leadership resource. So I hope this has been helpful for you tonight. I hope you've picked up some ideas, some thoughts, some ways to go back and really start creating a leadership culture in your ministry. As always, if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me or Kelly Brown at the conference office. And we just want to wish you a very blessed rest of the evening and a wonderful Holy Week next week. So blessings on you and your ministry.